My career is kind of interesting. The first third was Air Force base engineer, but then after that, I kind of split into two careers: a reservist and a civil servant, civilian side. On the reserve side, I had a tour at headquarters SAC where I did wargaming there. Oh, and by the way, when I was still active duty, I did wargaming in support of our prime beef team and took my team out to the Bragg Range. So headquarters SAC, Dias Air Force Base, checkmate at the that's the strategy cell in the basement of the Pentagon. And then my final assignment as a '06 was to the senior reservist at the information directorate. Well, while I was doing all that fun stuff as a reservist, I was a research assistant for the School of Advanced Air Power Studies, where I was their lead for wargaming there. And then after that, I became professor of wargaming and campaign planning at the Air Command and Staff College, where I did wargaming for them. Then when I retired from the reserves, I switched to a different civil service job doing wargaming for the Air Force Research Lab. Then for a couple of years, I helped the Air Force Materiel Command set up their wargaming branch before I switched back to the Air Force Research Lab doing wargaming in support of them. And that's when I retired and formed an LLC to do consulting and teaching still of wargaming. The two most relevant things to this audience is for almost 10 years, I was on the Air University Red Team. I have a t-shirt. I wasn't able to find it this morning where we replicated Soviet and other doctrine in executing those war games. And the other thing that I think is very relevant for this organization is that I came up with something called the Caffrey Triangle, which is the approach towards the options for red play within war games. And that's gotten a lot of traction. I think there's levels of immersion, but you forget about the fact that the very situation becomes immersive, where you're trying to make decisions and you're seeing the impact of those decisions. And that's clear if it's tabletop or role playing or computerized. Simulations Canada, a commercial outfit, did a war game years ago when Commodore 64 and Apple II days, where you commanded brigade on the Golan Heights, and it was all text. The game came with a little paper map of the Golan Heights, but you would send messages to subordinate units and get answers in, and it was all green numbers on a screen. And this guy's the reviewer's playing it, and he says he's things are getting grim and things might get run over, and I'm getting reinforcements. And then I get this message from one of my battalion commanders saying, Syrian tank is on my dugout. It's, we're getting overrun. Tell Ruth I love. And then the transmission ends. And he says, I broke into this cold sweat, like, oh my God, what am I going to tell Ruth? She's like, wait a minute. There is no Ruth. I'm in my home and it's 4:30 in the morning and I have work tomorrow. So that type of immersion was available back in the Commodore 64 years.
Mm.
It's still available today. I want to make sure I mention just how important you guys are. There's a book called Start With Why, and the work you're doing, the work the intelligence community does in general, particularly where it relates to war games, can be critically important. As we were talking before we started filming, I bought this book at a used bookstore in Manhattan back when I was in college. It's written in 1939 by three PhDs. They do a great job of proving that England and France will defeat Hitler. Didn't work out that way. And one of several reasons it didn't work out that way was the intelligence community playing red got it wrong.
Mm.
That the French did a war game of the Germans striking through the Ardennes and crossing the Meuse. And in their war game, the people playing red followed French doctrine. And when the Germans got to the river, they waited till their heavy artillery came up. And they still got across the river, but the French had time to bring up reserves, and it was a serious situation, but not critical. So the French treated it as serious, not critical. They built a few more pillboxes and they did a few other things. In the real war, the real Germans didn't wait for their heavy artillery. They used the Luftwaffe to cover the crossing. The French didn't have time to bring up any reserves, and the result was Dunkirk and the fall of France and everything else. And I got to believe if the French took action appropriate to the moderately bad outcome, they would have taken action to the serious outcome. So that's one thing. Getting red wrong in a war game can have really catastrophic consequences. The other thing is, and this is more in line with what you're saying, is that wargaming can help you become a better intel officer. And part of how it can help you become a better intel officer is to better understand your clients, better understand
Mm.
the decision makers that you're supporting. And that applies at the national strategic level all the way down to the tactical level. Again, before we started, I told the story about a good friend of mine who created this war game, was later published by the Air Force, and they were having an operational readiness inspection at Luke. And during the practice for the inspection, the intel officer would debrief the fighter pilots coming back, and it was like a person taking dictation. She didn't understand what was on the question. She didn't understand what the pilot was saying. She just wrote down what the words were. Well, in the couple weeks between the practice and the actual thing, he sat her down and played this. And this is not high tech. Again, this is pre-Commodore 64. This is a board game. Commercial version was later made, but still a board game. And they had her and other intel officers fly intercepts and do dogfighting and do all the rest. Didn't cost the Air Force a penny because it was done on a board game. When the actual operational readiness inspection took place, he says he wished he had a camera with him because this pilot came in for debrief. He was about 6'4". The intel professional was about 5'1". And she asked the first question, and then he started answering like last time. And she said, well, why did you do a high-low yo-yo when wouldn't a scissor have worked better? He looked at her like, what? And I thought about using a scissor, but it was better this. And the two of them started having a conversation. It was no longer just stenography. It was a conversation. And my time on the Air University Red Team, almost 10 years on the Red Team, when I was assigned to Checkmate, and that was a strategy cell for the Air Force in the basement. It's more detail, but anyway, I was not a pilot. I was this guy from Air University. But when we started talking about different options for different scenarios, I was able to keep up. And I was able to keep up because I had planned against different scenarios as a red player for 10 years. And
Uh-huh.
it was not quite as much of a shock as the fighter pilot looking at the intel officer. But the other guys in Checkmate were like, oh, he can actually keep into this conversation. So very, very, very valuable in both those ways. In lots of different war games. So almost anything you say, you can find exceptions. But
Mm.
in general, most of the time, especially in the past, wargaming has tended to be unoccupied tanks fighting against each other. You'd have these firepower scores, and these people would put all this time and effort into looking at the slope of the armor and the thickness and all this. And then, well, how proficient is the crew? Oh, we don't include any of that human stuff. And so I think what happened is those war games that were showing 24 hours and 48 hours were doing it based on hardware. And if
Mm.
you look at the hardware, if you
Right.
if the hardware was robots on both sides,
Yeah.
then it probably would have been 24 or 48 hours. The mismatch in motivation, the mismatch in expertise, the mismatch in strategy on both sides was really why it was different. And that's something that, intelligence community has been telling us how thick the armor is for years. And they've also been talking about the human part of it. But the human part of it is very, very important. A lot of nations were getting MiG-29s towards the end of the Cold War. And a very good friend of mine I can talk about a little bit more because he retired and then passed away. But the short version is he was in the intelligence community and he did a little bit of research and he said, well, this nation, the MiG-29s, they're not training pilots. They're not training maintenance crews. They've bought them for static displays so they can say, hey, we have MiG-29s. This nation, their pilots are getting more flight hours per month than the Soviets are. They've got all these maintenance initiatives. These MiG-29s, you really do have to pay attention to. If you only focused on the hardware, that whole spectrum would have been missed. The only other thing to plug, you say that I'm fairly knowledgeable about wargaming. People like to say he wrote the book. The book, you can download it from the Naval War College Press for free or get it for an unreasonable amount of money from the government printing office. And now that I'm retired, and I don't see a penny of royalties. It's fair because about a third of the time I wrote that, I was on duty and getting paid that way. Now I'm retired. We're breaking it into two halves. This is the application part of the book, and I'm currently working on the history part of the book. So if any of our listeners know something unclassified about the history of wargaming in the intelligence community elsewhere, I'd love to learn more. And the application part part is out now, and the history part we hope to get out by the end of the year.
Again, thank you very, very much, Matt. It was an honor to have you here.
It's an honor to talk to you. You guys are doing very important work.